Okay, our next section that we're going to deal with is something around the concept of classifying the types of climates, giving them a name, categorizing them, and breaking them down by certain information. Now, one of the things I come in with is the fact that we have something called the Köppen classification system. Now, the Köppen classification system uses some basic information, such as temperature and precipitation for a region, to help us out. Those are some things that they do, and it really helps. But also, one of the things that surprises people is they add in something called, hold on, let me make sure I don't misspell it here, because I'm a horrible, terrible, awful speller. Vegetation. Now, the concept of that is that you may have a dry climate and you may have a cold climate and a dry, warm climate. So you might find a specific type of moss growing only in the cold regions, but in the dry regions that are hot, you might find cacti. So we have different things like that. And we look at different information and we talk about comparison. So we start getting into groups, okay? So we're going to be able to classify things according to a couple different things. Now I'm going to bring in a couple of graphs and pictures here, and we're going to take a look at those and talk about how it looks and it arranges information based upon the precipitation and the rainfall, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, so we're looking at 3 different locations around the world here. So we've got a couple of different things. So let's take a look at Reno, Nevada. Now, the blue line there is talking about the temperature. So that line there is dealing with the temperature. Same thing on this graph, same thing on this graph. Now, let's take a look at what happens in Reno, Nevada. Okay? Now, we're going to just focus on the fact that we have a lower temperature, a higher temperature, and a lower temperature. So let's focus on the months now. So this is January, this is February, this is our summer. So this location here has a tendency to change its temperature. Okay? So when we see a change in temperature, we normally consider this to be something similar to a temperate climate. Because a temperate climate will have a tendency to swing between the variations of temperature. Now, that's often considered a mild climate. Now, this one here has a very low precipitation level, so that means that we're going to be fairly dry. Now, let's take a look at New Guinea. Do you notice the fact that it seems that the temperature almost doesn't change at all, and it's quite warm? Well, that's probably going to give us something similar to our tropical climate. Now let's take a look at the precipitation. It's extremely wet there. I mean, lots and lots of rain all year long. It seems quite a bit of rain. Now we move on over to Australia. We notice that it stays quite warm almost all year round. Just a little bit of a dip during their winter time in the temperature. Not much, not substantial change. But we do notice this is an extremely dry climate. So, that they consider that to be a fairly dry. Now, but we notice we do have what they can call a rainy season. Rainy season. Now, many of you have watched some of the videos from Africa and stuff. And they'll talk about when the rainy season comes, the animals have a tendency to migrate. So that's what we're talking about there. Now, we're going to look at a full map of the globe and take a look at some of the climate areas for it. And then we're going to break down and categorize some of the climates. Okay, now a couple of things that I really want to point out to you is the following. This polar climates, we have something called a tundra, an ice cap, and a highland. So if we look at North America in particular, and we take a look very closely at it, you'll notice that most, if not all, of Canada and most of Alaska is what we consider to be a tundra. Okay? Now, The ice cap you can see way over there in the corner. But now, when we look at some other regions that are called polar, they're called highlands. That means where the altitude is high enough to have a substantially lower temperature than the surrounding region. Now, we have tropical wet and dry. Tropical wet and dry means they're going to go through the season, like the savanna type. Semi-arid, it gets rain but not very much. So we have a lot of classifications and categories. So we're going to see that this in our world here is based upon temperature, precipitation, and we can use vegetation to help us identify them and discuss them. Now, referring back to the map that we just saw earlier, one of the things that we're talking about is we have the tropical wet climates. Then we normally identify those with as our rainforests and such. And when we talk about the areas that are kind of around them, and that the ones that border them, you'll notice that if we go back and we refer to the map, that the regions surrounding those are normally considered to be wet and dry. That means that they have a seasonal wet and dry season. That was the Australian map that we graphical that we showed earlier, and that's primarily in our savanna regions. From that, we move on to something dry climate. Okay, when we're looking at this, one of the next things that we're going to talk about is the dry climate. Now, the dry climates make up about 30% of the Earth's land that we have. Now, that's kind of important because if you sit down and think about 30% of our entire land mass is in a dry climate. That means as far as population and stuff like that, these are not really greatly feasible for food production. So we run into that problem. We automatically think of deserts as a great example of the dry climates, and we think of the Sahara and the Gobi and the Great Australian Desert, and that helps us classify those. However, normally what we'll deal with, the fact is that around that region, say we have a desert region right here, and this is on our map, we will have a little region around it that will border it that we normally call something called semi-arid. Now that semi-arid region gets a little bit of precipitation, but not much more. However, it does have a tendency to run a little bit more humidity. And that's when we see the dew forming in the mornings or the evenings. So that helps generate moisture for the vegetation. So the semi-arid region will definitely have a whole lot more vegetation than the desert region. Okay, so that's one of the things that we can deal with. Now, when we talk about that, you got to remember, so somewhere around that arid region is probably a region that has a heavy vegetation concentration, as long as with a decent amount of precipitation. Okay? Move on to something called our mild climates. Now, our mild climates is normally what we would consider to be something similar to West Virginia. Southeastern United States is a type of this climate, so South Carolina, North Carolina, stuff like that. So we see conditions that are fairly warm, just cycle of temperature from winter to summer, back to winter, and we'll see a precipitation that varies a little bit. Now, parts of South America and stuff like that, we see that. Mediterranean climates out in around the Mediterranean Ocean, we'll see that. So we deal with that on a lot. And these types of mild climates, whether or not it's high precipitation or low precipitation, can give definitely a relationship to your proximity to a coastal region for movement of wind. Sit down and think about that. So if we look at a horrible, terrible, awful picture of the United States here, and we talk about this, and we look at that horrible, awful picture of the United States, if we're in here in the Gulf of Mexico, right in this region here, and we have a wind that blows that way, all of those regions down there are going to be probably a little bit wetter than the regions farther to the north. Why? They have a little bit, they're closer to the body of water that provides them precipitation. Now, the next category that we're going to get to is something called a continental climate. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is what we consider to be the continental climates. We normally have it be what we call considered the warm summers. We have three types: warm summer, cool summer, and the subarctic regions. Now, a lot of these are going to be associated directly with the central part of our United States. So the dead center part of our United States we would consider to be mainly in that region there. Now, you're going to notice that we have tremendous swings in the temperature and the weather systems that happen in this area. So we have a tendency to have a long list of problems. We know that we have this region here, which we consider to be what's called Tornado Alley. And why do we see that? Well, let's take a look. What's happening here? We have a couple of different air masses that have a tendency to meet in that region and cause our problems with the tornadoes and such. So this is signified with violent changes in weather because we have all of those different air masses that will affect it. Okay? So that's some of the things that we're going to deal with. Now, when we move on to the next part of it, we talk about something called a polar climate. Now, the polar climate is kind of obvious. It's going to be directly related to the regions that are cold. Now, the tundra is one of the types that we talked about that is primarily in Alaska and a few other regions. It's known for its low temperatures, and normally if it gets warm in that region there, it might get up to maybe a really good high temperature might be 50 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? So it never really gets warm. Now, a couple of things that are special about that, there are no trees. Boom, 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 no trees. So we have a lot of dense shrubbery and stuff like that. A lot of times we don't see a lot of rain, so it's a little bit less moisture. And the next region that we talk about in this is the ice cap region. How did we classify it earlier? The ice cap region, definitely completely covered with snow and ice all year round. The last part is kind of, remember, is the one that is considered the highland climate. Now this is where we talk about like the Andes Mountains and stuff like that, where we get up high enough in the mountains that the temperature stays cold. Okay? Now, a couple of things that we're going to talk called microclimates, or little areas of the world where we have just specific things occur. Now, when we talk about a microclimate, we have a couple of different things we've got. So let's go that, like, here's a big city on a map, and then we have the big city of Hamlin here on the map. So this city here may be huge. It might be the size of New York City. Okay? Now, tell me some features about a city that big. Well, number one, there's almost no grass. Number two, there's a lot of blacktop and concrete. Now, I don't know about you, but I prefer not to walk around on blacktop in the middle of summer with no shoes on. Why? It gets really hot. Okay? So, we go to our little town of Hamlin over here, and we go to the summer. Let's take a look at what we think would probably happen to the average daily temperature. So, the city, if Hamlin is a hot summer's day of 85 degrees Fahrenheit, we might go to the city and it might be 92 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's going to be a significant difference in the city's temperature versus the small city's temperature. And it gets even more so when you spread it out to the country. Okay? So the farther we are away from concrete, block, and things like that, the more we have a variance of the temperature. So let's take a look. This occurs in our regions right now. We have Canal City and the Charleston area. So we have a mountain over here. Then we have the river valley here. And we have a smaller set of mountains here. And we have the city of Charleston here in the center. Now we know this. Wind doesn't do this. It doesn't come over the top of the mountain and go, I'm going to blow across the bottom of the valley and I'm going to go up the mountain. It doesn't work that way. So the wind doesn't do that. So the wind's going to go right across the top of the mountains. So what does that mean about the heat and such that's occurring in this region here? It's going to be a lot hotter down here. It's going to, a lot of us refer to it as the stuffy feeling. Like there's no air circulation and no air movement. And all of the pollution and the smog and everything else just builds up in this little trap. And sometimes we'll call that a heat island, or a region that gets excessively hot compared to their surrounding regions. Now that's going to wrap us up for a lot of the topics for this section.